This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi. We are media partners for ORCA's global conference on new Sinology, and our expert today is Neil Thomas. He's with the Asia Society Policy Institute, ASPI, in Washington. Neil, thank you so much. I know it's been really hectic getting into Delhi and talking to all of us and giving us time, but thanks so much.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be visiting India for the first time.
Hopefully many more times. Neil, one of your talks that we heard again in the conference was about Quad and how the U.S. sees India as a critical partner. But you did mention a caveat. It depends who the POTUS is. If you want to enlarge on that thought.
I think that whoever the POTUS is, they'll see India as being a really important partner in the Indo-Pacific. The real difference will be how they approach working with allies and partners like India more generally. So if we have a more America First president, then we're going to see a lot of unilateral policy making that doesn't have so much regard for the different policy environments, different economic interests of American partners in the region. That unilateral policy, it may be, going, more in favor of the policies, these other countries want, but it may also be going against them. So, for example, with the Quad, if we saw a U.S. president framing it much more as an anti-China alliance and making it explicitly about this kind of new Cold War, if you want to call it that, then that's going to, make countries like India, which values its strategic autonomy, more uncomfortable. Also make, U.S. allies like Australia and Japan, who are obviously much closer to China geographically and have, maybe some deeper economic interests there in terms of proportion of their economies and trade. It'll make them uncomfortable as well. So that's, I think, the main difference in terms of who's in the White House. To what extent is America willing to bring along its allies and partners in creating an effective China strategy that, sees strength through unity rather than going it alone and hoping for the best.
You also talked about the challenges and the opportunities that the Quad has in its evolution. We've seen how it's evolved and died and been resurrected. If you want to talk about that as well.
Sure. I think the Quad, was moribund, as we all know, for more than a decade, and it was revived at the working level in 2017, at the ministerial level in 2019, and then finally at the leadership level in 2021. Notably after the Biden administration took office and kind of, really embraced this more collective allies and partners focused approach, which I think helped the other countries to be comfortable with and really elevating that Quad to the next step and, institutionalizing it as a leadership summit. Which, critically important for the signaling value of the Quad to China, and also for actually coordinating between those four countries to commit resources and deliver tangible programs that benefit other countries in the region. And that's kind of the approach we're seeing the Quad taking now. It's evolved from being a disaster response grouping in 2004 to being a very security-oriented grouping, maybe when, in 2017, 2019, that type of time. It's now being very explicitly about providing public goods for the region. And at least the way the United States sees it and wants it to be, to show that democracies like the United States are in the region, not just as a security presence, but as partners that can deliver benefits to other countries and in a way that is more transparent and ultimately more effective for recipient countries.
And the challenges that you see in the near future?
The challenges for the Quad are firstly, the attention that's given by leaders in the four countries and the resources they're prepared to commit. So we've seen some, initial positive steps like cooperation on maritime domain awareness. A recent thing that came out of the May leaders meeting was working with the Pacific island of Palau to upgrade their telecommunications infrastructure with the ORCA technology. So those are good first steps. It's a good start, but there's a lot more that could be done. And if we don't see that commitment to on-the-ground change and resources, then other countries in the region, maybe even some Quad governments themselves will start to question whether it's an effective grouping and, whether there's actually any real, meat on the bones of these efforts to provide a competitor to China's efforts in the development space. That's one big issue. Another challenge is obviously the attitude that's brought to the Quad by the United States, which is, the most important member of this group. I mean, is it a diplomatic priority? Is the U.S. really engaged with the region in a way that values these allies and partnership groupings? So if we saw a drop-off in that would be a huge challenge to the Quad. And I think maybe a longer-term challenge that's worth, thinking about and proactively planning for, amongst the Quad governments would be, if we do get to a stage in, a few years or decades where there is a serious security incident with China, whether that's a kind of blockade scenario around Taiwan or a military dust-up in the South China Sea, there are different interests that different governments have there between the United States, India, Australia, Japan. So what would the response be, and how would those differences be managed? Because I think that, if something like that happened today, there'd be a bit of a shock to the system, because the United States would be in one place, preparing to potentially get directly involved with China in a military way, and the other countries, especially India, having very different views of what the correct response should be. And to avoid, misunderstandings, to avoid such an incident, really breaking apart the Indo-Pacific coalitions that, America and its allies and partners are building, preparation is needed, honest conversations are needed, and, perhaps there's other ways apart from direct military involvement, such as through economic responses, sanctions that can be thought about in advance, and that element of surprise, and hopefully nothing like that ever happens, but that element of surprise can be reduced, and, everyone will know where each other's country stands, and, there'll be a stronger response, and also stronger deterrence. If we know that's in place, if China knows, those things are in place, then it's, less likely maybe to, overstep the line and do something that it regrets.
Sanctions, something that India would, I think, would be a red line, because we look at only UN-led sanctions. But when you talk about managing differences, or of course, like you pointed out, the Quad has moved from Sherpa level to a summit level, and President Biden had a big part to play in that. But if you look at the individual countries, India and the U.S., India and Japan, India and Australia, and I presume U.S. with other bilateral partnerships as well, there is something that is called a 2+2, say the defense and the foreign ministers who continuously meet. Do you think that that level can help if it's added here, a 2+2, or in this case, what, it'll be a 4+4, I presume?
Within the Quad.
Within the Quad.
I mean, ultimately, more dialogue, more communication makes for better diplomatic relations. So I think that, if the Quad is to, survive and thrive into the future, then the more, dialogue mechanisms that are built up around it, the more it's an institutionalized pattern of conversation and communication and, working together to solve Indo-Pacific problems, the more it's likely to endure and actually, deliver on its promises to the region. So I think that, that's going to be key to the building up of, habits of cooperation will be key to, preparing for these potential shocks to the system, and, just know where each other stands.
Again, the Quad is not a structured grouping partnership, what they want to call it in that sense. But there have been calls even by Indian analysts. Do you see a necessity or, again, a further evolution of the Quad to having, say, a permanent secretariat? There have been calls for even India to be pushed a little bit more on Quad by having it in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. I mean, how do you see that going in terms of the Quad?
Yeah, I don't think the Quad will be institutionalized in that way. I mean, in terms of these, the institutionalization that I'm kind of speaking of, it's more that institution of dialogue and, cooperation, which is what we are seeing, beginning to, the wheels are beginning to kind of start moving in a more serious way. And, that is an institution because it's a regular thing. It's a habit. It's kind of becomes a part of what's expected from the diplomacy of all these countries. Not just amongst each other, but also within the broader region. And I mean, that's key to making the Quad effective. I don't think it necessarily needs that next level of having a secretariat and a headquarters. And there's only 4 countries as well, so there's probably enough diplomatic capital and resources they have between them to run it on a government to government to government to government basis rather than having to institutionalize it.
And if you'd like to talk about the India-U.S. relationship in parallel to the Quad, if there are any hiccups or roadblocks in bilateral relationship, does that impact the Quad or vice versa? If we're doing better on bilateral ties, does that have an impact on the Quad?
I think it does have an impact on the Quad. I mean, I think for the United States, India is really the critical ingredient in the Quad recipe. I mean, India is the only country in the Quad that's not a formal U.S. security ally, and that's the critical signal to the region that the U.S. isn't just about its old post-World War II security partners. It's serious about cooperating and listening to and working with other regional powers, India being primarily among them. So I think that the health of U.S.-India relations is really critical. And right now we're in a moment where U.S.-India relations are very strong. I mean, Prime Minister Modi had an extremely successful visit to Washington, D.C. and to other places in America just a few months ago. A huge focus on technology and, military sales as well from the U.S. to India, new steps, new horizons in U.S.-India relations. There's obviously, challenges that could crop up on the horizons. I mentioned earlier about different views on how to respond to a security crisis with China, different views on Russia and Russia's invasion of Ukraine and what to do about that. And who knows what the crises will be over the next 5, 10, 15 years. But fundamentally, the United States has a view of the world where it wants to maintain this what it calls a rules-based international order and maintain a security order as well that is rooted in American power and that preserves that and preserves these systems of government that have, or international order rather, that have lasted since the Second World War. Whereas India is a rising power. India values strategic autonomy, and India has different views on a lot of these crisis, even if there is a lot of alignment in terms of democracy and prosperity and peace in the Indo-Pacific, which is what fuels the Quad. So I think that if there was a big bust-up in U.S.-India relations, it would potentially be fatal for the Quad. And so that's why it's important for both governments and the broader Quad to pay attention to these potential friction points and work to avoid them.
Friction points, Russia, of course, you mentioned Russia and Ukraine. Currently, there's a bit of an issue about Canada and how the U.S. and the Five Eyes see it and how India sees the issue. But it's at times like that skeptics, and I think they would be on both sides, skeptics about the India-U.S. relationships, whether it's, in capital or the administration or policy warmth, or on this side as well, who have a trust deficit from a legacy point of view with the U.S., India and the U.S. And you see those voices coming out, when issues like Canada, I don't know how it'll pan out. How deep is the mistrust among certain, I don't know what to call them, a group of people on both sides, and can that affect the India-U.S. relationship?
Well, I think on the U.S. side, if you look at least the Biden administration, if you look also at the Trump administration, to the last 2 governments on both sides of American politics, I think the general view amongst those policymakers, both Republican and Democrat, is that India is an important partner for the U.S. I mean, you can't really have an Indo-Pacific rather than Asia-Pacific strategy without India. I mean, it really is the linchpin of that, kind of new generation of thinking about how the U.S. should approach Asia and kind of expand its vision of what's possible there. So I think that the health of U.S.-India relations at a government-to-government level is likely to be quite robust, actually. I think that it would take a lot more than what's happened to get the United States government to change its stance on the Indo-Pacific and to, abandon its efforts to, cultivate India as a strategic partner and to, kind of work towards India's success as well, especially as that's, a major counterweight to China. So absent that kind of sea change in US foreign policy, I can't see the US-India relationship being kind of relegated in the near future.
And a lot of changes happen because of the foundational agreements that India and the US have signed. There are reports of military intelligence being shared vis-a-vis what's happening in China and the border and the clashes there. But again, I want to bring up the issue about skeptics because they do raise this voice, at least in India, and I presume it's the same in Washington or the US as well, questioning the reliability of the US in a crunch time because of what's happened, say, in the past from 1971 onwards, etc. And the realization that India will have to fight its own battles. I mean, if there are clashes with China, or God forbid there is a war, ultimately with its Quad, it's India which is going to fight that battle. How do you put that in kind of perspective, or how do you wrap your head around that?
I guess, with any issue, right, there's going to be more than one perspective on it. And I think that fundamentally that's, a strength of our democratic systems in the United States, in India, also in Australia and Japan, right? That's really a foundational part of, what the Quad is. So I think that, we have to, we should embrace the fact that there are different views on all of these political issues. And, obviously, at some point you have to make a decision if you're in government about where to go. And I think, as I explained before, I think, the US government's going to continue deepening its relationship with India and trying to make the Quad successful. But, the fact that there are skeptics and they can air their views and we can have debates and that we can criticize our governments is, a cause for celebration, because that's something that China doesn't have. And unfortunately, the Chinese people cannot partake in. So I think that, skeptics should be celebrated, even if they hold views that one disagrees with.
You talked earlier about how differences, say, should be managed or at least gamed in terms of situations that could arise in the future. I'm talking about Taiwan. Who knows what China is going to do with its blockade forcibly, or doesn't take that action. What is the path you see the US taking in case it becomes a worst case scenario, and how do you see the US bringing its allies, especially in the Quad, in such a situation?
It's a tough question. I personally don't think that China's going to do something like invading or probably even blockading Taiwan in the near future. But if that were to happen, then I think that a lot, again, depends on the exact nature. Like, is this a full-on, maritime assault, a full-on invasion? Is it a full blockade? Is it a partial blockade? Is it a kind of lesser type of quarantine of certain goods? But I think, the general feeling that I get being in Washington, D.C. is that, the United States, really sees Taiwan as, a critical part of this first island chain of, the American defense posture in the Indo-Pacific. So it's a huge asset militarily, strategically, diplomatically, because of its democracy, economically, because of semiconductor supply chains, that, those factors, would feed into a likelihood that America would definitely become involved, at least economically, I think, in terms of sanctions. And we'd be looking at things resembling at least the sanctions placed on Russia, despite them being very costly. There would be, I think, a real political moment of skepticism, not just outright hostility towards China, in a way that we kind of saw break out after Russia invaded Ukraine, that would allow things to become possible politically in a short space of time that wouldn't be at the moment because of the economic interests that the United States still has, and indeed in some ways still encourages with China. And I think militarily as well, the United States has this relatively large force stationed in the region, and I think it'd become under a lot of pressure to use it, to at least try in the initial stages to deter China from going any further, to try and get it to stand down, and then to protect what is not just some place in the Pacific Ocean, but what is increasingly being seen as a fundamental interest by American policymakers.
If you want to just encapsulate your thoughts on, you spoke about it also, on China post-Xi. I mean, how do you visualize it? What are your thoughts on that? I mean, if and when it happens, at some point of time, obviously it would have to happen.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think the most analytically rigorous answer we can give is basically just 3 words: we don't know. We don't know, how Xi will be succeeded. We don't know when Xi will be succeeded. We don't know who will succeed Xi. And without that knowledge, it's hard to make judgments then about what would that do for China's politics, its economy, its foreign policies. But I think we can at least engage in some informed speculation. We know from previous succession battles in China, particularly the succession from Mao Zedong eventually to Deng Xiaoping, that there was a lot of intra-party fighting and disagreement, and fundamentally reinforces the idea that this is a kind of an unpredictable, dynamic process. We can look to which leaders below Xi currently hold positions of power and have networks of potential supporters behind them. So in Xi's 3rd term, which began last October at the 20th Party Congress, there's kind of 2 major networks of Xi supporters that have emerged. One based on officials who knew him in or kind of through Fujian province, where he spent most of the 80s, 90s as a provincial leader there. It kind of goes all the way up to Cai Chi, who is formerly the 5th ranked leader, but he runs the Central Secretariat and the CCP's general office. It really controls the nerve center of party operations. And there's another group kind of based on officials who know Xi from Zhejiang province, where he's a leader in the mid-2000s, kind of goes all the way up to Premier Li Qiang, who's formerly number 2 in the party system. So, if we saw, if Xi left the scene tomorrow, he resigned or got sick, then, it's likely at least that, those 2 networks would be the locus of any type of power struggle. And, one of those figures perhaps would be, a likely successor. But again, it would be a very dynamic process. The security services, the military become involved in terms of endorsing particular leaders. There'd be, negotiations behind the scenes that, maybe someone else would emerge as the kind of consensus candidate, or is able to manipulate the process of how the next leader is selected to install themselves as leader and kind of present a fait accompli to the rest of the party. So we don't know, but we can speculate in a way that's at least grounded in some relatively well-known facts about Chinese politics.
So Neil, again, thank you so much for your time. A little bit of it that you spent in informed speculation, and most of it in sharing both your expertise and your experiences. Thanks again.
Thank you so much for having me.
Pleasure's all ours. And for our viewers, do give us feedback on this interview. If you want any particular topics to be discussed or some analysts that we can get on the show, do let us know. Follow our social media handles for the latest, the articles we put up on our website, or interviews like this with Neil Thomas on our YouTube channel. There's also a QR code that's on your screen if you're inclined to support us financially. This is Amitabh, and you're watching StratNews Global.